carriage jolts, and pain moves through your body like a wave finding the weakest wall in a house. Rain drums against the leather hood above your head, and through a gap in the curtain, you catch your first sight of it. A mass of grey stone rising out of the mist, taller than anything else on the street, chimneys breathing smoke into a sky the color of ash. Nobody in the carriage speaks. Your mother's hand tightens around yours, and you understand, without being told, that this silence is its own kind of language. Everyone in this city has heard the stories. Some who pass through those doors come out cured. Others come out in a box 3 days or 3 weeks later, and no one, not the surgeon, not the physician, not the sister who nursed them through the night, will ever be entirely sure why. Waiting inside is the very best that medicine has to offer in this century. It is also, in ways nobody standing at these gates can yet see, dangerous almost beyond measure. There are no drugs to kill infection, no machines to look inside the body, no real understanding of what turns a clean wound fatal in the space of 3 quiet days. There is only skill and hope, and an enemy nobody in this building has ever seen, because nobody yet knows it is there. The carriage stops. Someone opens the door. Cold air rushes in, carrying rain and cold smoke, and underneath both, something else. Something you will come to know very well before this night is finished. It is time to go inside. The porter reaches you before your family does. He says nothing at first, just looks at your face, your color, the way you hold your side, the way a man looks at a horse he is deciding whether to buy. Then he nods once and holds the door. Above his head hangs a stone plaque bearing the hospital's name, weathered soft at the edges by 70 years of London rain. Beneath it, smaller letters remind anyone who cares to read them that this is a voluntary hospital, built not by the state, not by the church, but by the subscriptions of wealthy citizens who gave their money in exchange for a kind of quiet power. It is a detail most patients never notice on their way through the door. It will decide almost everything about what happens to you next. Getting this far was not simple. Not for you, and not for almost anyone else waiting in the hall behind you. In most hospitals across the city, this one included, a sick person cannot simply arrive and ask to be treated. What they need first is a ticket, a letter of recommendation signed by one of the hospital's subscribers, the men and women whose annual donations bought them the right to send patients through these doors and to vote, once a year, on which physicians and surgeons would be permitted to work inside them. Without a governor's signature, the doors do not open. It does not matter how much pain you are in. So the sick go looking for signatures the way other people go looking for medicine. They call at the houses of subscribers they have never met. They wait in kitchens and on servants' steps, hoping to catch 5 minutes with someone who has the power to save them with the stroke of a pen. They beg through footmen. They return the next day, and the day after that, while the illness they came to plead about grows worse with every hour spent waiting in the cold. It is, by any measure, a strange kind of medicine, one where healing depends less on how sick you are than on who you know, or who your mother once did a kindness for, or which family still owes yours a favor from years before you were born. There is one hospital in the city that works differently. At the Royal Free, sickness alone is considered enough. No governor, no ticket, no letter. Only the plain fact of suffering. It is spoken of among the poor of London, almost the way people speak of a kind of miracle. Most, though, are not so fortunate. Most arrive the way you did tonight, carrying a folded letter instead of a bag, because the letter tonight matters more than anything you own. A family 2 streets from yours spent 4 days chasing a signature before your own letter was secured. You know this because your mother told you in the flat, exhausted voice she uses only for facts too heavy to say any other way. 4 days of standing at kitchen doors that were not theirs to knock on. 4 days of asking servants to carry their name upstairs to someone who might, if the hour was convenient and the mood was right, agree to help a stranger they would never meet. By the time the letter finally came, the illness it was meant to answer had already run its course, one way or the other. Nobody in your family says which way out loud. You do not ask. Even so, the letter alone is not enough. Inside, past the entrance hall, a man in a dark coat sits behind a high desk with a ledger open in front of him. This is where the second test begins, quieter than the first, and in its way, crueler. He asks your name, your parish, your trade, if you have one, and your father's trade before that. He asks whether you can pay anything at all toward your keep, and watches your face carefully while you answer, because the answer to that question will decide almost everything about the next several weeks of your life. Too poor, and you are sent elsewhere, to a workhouse infirmary where paupers are nursed by other paupers in rooms with no pretense of comfort at all, too able to pay, and you are turned away in the other direction, toward a private physician, a rented sick room, care bought rather than given. This hospital, like almost every voluntary hospital in the city, exists for the narrow band of humanity caught precisely in between. Not so poor as to belong to the parish, not so comfortable as to belong to a private practice. The clerk's pen hovers. He is deciding, in the space of a few quiet questions, whether you belong here at all. There is a further question, one he does not ask aloud, but you can feel him weighing all the same. Are you the kind of sick that can be helped? Because not every form of suffering earns a bed in this building. The chronically ill are turned away, not out of cruelty exactly, but because a hospital built on the charity of subscribers must show results, must be able to say at the end of each year how many patients it cured. A disease with no ending offers nothing to show the donors. An old man with a wasting illness that will not improve, no matter how long he is nursed, is quietly redirected elsewhere. Not because no one believes he suffers, but because his suffering cannot be turned into the kind of yearly report a subscriber likes to read over breakfast. Nor, in most cases, will they admit the mad, who are sent instead to institutions built for confinement rather than cure. Nor, strange as it sounds, will they always take the most infectious. Cholera, smallpox, the fevers that spread from bed to bed like fire through dry grass. Because a single outbreak inside these walls could empty half the ward within a week, and everyone behind this desk already knows it. Even without understanding why disease spreads the way it does, long experience has taught this hospital exactly how quickly it can, and how little stands between one sick bed and the next. You are neither too well nor too far gone. You are, in the particular arithmetic of this place, exactly sick enough. Before the clerk will write anything final in his ledger, a second man is sent for, younger than the clerk, in a coat not quite clean, who introduces himself only as the house surgeon on duty tonight. He does not ask your name. He asks you to sit and takes your wrist between 2 fingers, counting silently while he watches a small clock on the wall behind the desk. He presses 2 fingers beneath your jaw then along your throat, then rests the flat of his palm against your forehead for a moment, too brief to mean anything to you, and entirely sufficient, apparently, to mean something to him. He asks you to open your mouth, to breathe in and hold it and let it go. His hands are cold and quick, and entirely without gentleness, not from cruelty, but from repetition. You are perhaps the 11th patient he has examined this way since his shift began, and there will be a dozen more before it ends. There is no instrument pressed to your chest tonight. That particular practice, listening to the sounds inside a body through a hollow wooden tube, is known to some physicians in this city and unknown, still, to a great many others. Tonight, his own 2 hands and a lifetime of half-training are the only instruments he has. He straightens, makes a short note on a slip of paper, and hands it to the clerk without a word to you at all. Whatever verdict it carries, you are not permitted to read it. You will learn only its consequence, which ward, which bed, which corner of the building you now belong to, and never quite the reasoning behind it. The clerk dips his pen and writes your name into the ledger. Somewhere beneath it, in a column you cannot quite read upside down, is a second note, a small unofficial mark some admitting officers use for patients who arrive in a state judged too dirty, too vermin-ridden, too far past the reach of ordinary washing. At certain hospitals in this city, such patients are charged double for their keep, on the theory that filth costs more to manage than illness does. You cannot tell from where you are standing whether that mark has been made beside your name. You will only find out later in the way such things are always found out, quietly and without anyone quite saying it aloud. For now, there is only the sound of the pen and the rain still finding its way in through the open door behind you, and your family standing a little apart, no longer quite sure whether they are permitted to follow you any further. They are not. This is the part no one warns you about. A hand, not unkind, simply practical, separates you from the people who brought you here. Your mother's fingers slip from yours. There will be visiting hours, the porter says, though not tonight and not for several days yet, until the physicians have had the chance to form their first opinion of your case. Between now and then, you belong in every meaningful sense to the institution. Your clothes are taken next and listed in a second ledger, item by item, in handwriting far more careful than anything written about your illness. One coat, grey, worn at the cuffs, one pair of boots, one small locket, silver on a chain. The clerk's assistant turns the locket over once in his fingers, checking for a hallmark, before setting it into a small, numbered box that will sit on a shelf alongside dozens of identical boxes until you either come to collect it or someone else does on your behalf. It is a strange kind of undressing, not simply of clothing, but of the small evidence of who you were before tonight. In their place, a plain hospital gown, coarse against the skin, smelling faintly of the carbolic soap used to wash the last patient who wore it, and the one before that, and however many before him. You are led down a corridor that seems to run the entire length of the building. Stone floors, whitewashed walls, gas lamps spaced too far apart, so that the light comes in pools separated by long stretches of shadow, and you walk from one small island of brightness into darkness, and back into brightness again, over and over, the whole way down. The smell reaches you before the ward itself does. Coal smoke first, then soap, then something sharper underneath both. Vinegar, splashed liberally along the skirting boards and window ledges, one of 100 small rituals believed in this decade to hold disease at bay. Fresh bread drifts faintly from a kitchen somewhere below, and beneath every one of these smells, present in a way no amount of vinegar or soap has ever fully managed to erase, is another scent entirely. The particular, unmistakable smell of many frightened people breathing the same close air, night after night, in rooms that were never quite built large enough for all of them. You will stop noticing it by morning. Everyone does. That too is something no one tells you in advance. How quickly the body learns to accept as ordinary the very things that terrified it only hours before. Halfway down the corridor, you're made to stand aside. 2 orderlies pass in the opposite direction, moving quickly, carrying a covered stretcher between them. You do not see a face. You are not meant to. The porter beside you does not slow his pace or lower his voice to acknowledge what has just gone by. This, too, is simply part of the corridor tonight. The way the gas lamps are, the way the vinegar smell is. One more ordinary fact of a building where such facts arrive with more regularity than anyone standing in it would like to admit. Somewhere ahead, muffled by 2 closed doors, you can just make out a sound that might be a cough or might be something closer to weeping. It is impossible to tell which, and something in you decides quietly not to ask. The porter stops outside a pair of tall double doors, heavier than the others you have passed, fitted with a small glass panel too fogged with condensation to see clearly through. On the other side, faintly, you can hear the particular hush of a room holding 30 or 40 people at once. Not silence exactly, but a kind of collective stillness, broken here and there by the creak of an iron bed frame, a low murmur, the scrape of a chair being drawn a few inches closer to someone's side. A woman's shape moves behind the glass, unhurried, the way someone moves when they have walked this same short distance 10,000 times before and expect to walk it 10,000 times again. The porter knocks once, out of habit rather than necessity, and pushes the door open before anyone answers. Warm air rolls out to meet you, thick with the smell of the ward itself, close and human and impossible to fully describe, until you have stood, as you are standing now, directly inside it. The sister glances up from whatever she was doing and takes you in all at once, the way the porter did at the entrance. Face, color, posture, the small telling details a trained eye learns to read in a single glance. She is younger than you expected and older than she looks, in the particular way of women who have spent years on their feet through the small hours of the night. Her apron is clean. Her hands are not dirty exactly, but marked, roughened, the hands of someone who has washed 100 fevered brows and changed 1,000 dressings, and will, before this night is finished, do a good deal of both again. She says nothing at all. She only nods, exactly as the porter did, and steps aside to let you pass. Beyond her, in 2 long rows, stretching the length of the room, 30 beds wait beneath a row of tall, dark windows, each one holding someone whose story you do not yet know. A lamp burns low at the far end, somewhere among the shapes beneath the blankets. Someone shifts and sighs, and settles again into whatever uneasy rest this ward allows. The door closes softly behind you. Tonight, you will learn several of their stories. Tonight, this room, its smells, its sounds, the particular hush that 30 frightened people make together in the dark, becomes the entire boundary of your world. The first thing you understand about this room, before you understand anything else about it, is the cold. Not the cold of neglect, the cold of design. It moves across your skin the moment the door shuts behind you. A steady, deliberate draft, sliding the length of the ward from one bank of windows to the other, stirring the lamp flames, lifting the corner of a loose bedsheet 2 rows away. Somewhere above you, a window has been left open a hand's width, despite the hour, despite the rain that was still falling when you arrived. It will stay open all night. It will stay open most nights, whatever the season, whatever the weather, because the people who built this room believed, with the complete and untroubled certainty of their age, that the open window is the single thing standing between the patients in these beds and a slower, less visible kind of death. Foul air kills. That is the plain, unshakable premise beneath everything you are about to see. Not foul air in the poetic sense, not a metaphor for sickness or sin, but foul air quite literally, breathed and rebreathed by too many lungs in too small a space, thickening hour by hour into something the physicians of this century call miasma. No one in this building has ever seen a miasma. No one needs to. They have seen what happens in wards without enough windows, without enough distance between one bed and the next. Seen mortality figures that rise and fall, not with the severity of the illnesses admitted, but with the size and freshness of the rooms those illnesses are nursed in. The conclusion, to men who have watched this pattern for decades, seems beyond argument. Bad air is not a symptom of a dying ward. Bad air is the disease itself, spreading invisibly from bed to bed, on every breath drawn and released. And so, windows, as many as the walls will bear. They run in a long, even row down both sides of the room, tall enough that a grown man could stand inside one, spaced with almost mathematical precision. One window for every second bed, so that no patient lies more than a few feet from a source of moving air. The ward itself is not one room among many crowded under a single roof, but its own separate block entirely, standing apart from its neighbors, joined to the rest of the hospital only by a long open corridor that lets air pass freely beneath it. Newer hospitals across the city are being built this same way now, one long ward building set beside another, like a row of glass houses, each one turned to catch the light from the east in the morning and let it go by evening, each one deliberately kept far enough from the next that no vitiated air drifting from one can settle into another. It is called, by the architects who designed them, the pavilion principle. The idea that a hospital should not be a single vast building at all, but a village of small, well-aired ones, standing shoulder to shoulder and breathing independently of each other. It is, in its way, an act of enormous faith, a whole science of healing built on a theory no one has ever been able to prove, and one which, though almost no one in this room could yet explain why, is not nearly as wrong as it will one day be made to sound. Moving air does carry something away from a crowded ward, even if the men who insist upon it cannot yet say what. For now, it is simply cold and constant, and something you will learn over the coming nights to stop fighting. There is a further precision to the design that you will only come to appreciate slowly, over days rather than hours. The nurse's own small room sits at the very entrance to the ward, so that no one can come or go without being seen. The washroom and closets stand at the opposite end entirely, sealed off behind their own short, cross-ventilated passage, so that whatever air rises from them is carried outward and away, rather than back across the beds. Even the width of the room has been argued over. A continental hospital much admired by the men who designed this one keeps exactly 2 beds to every window, no more, on the theory that any greater crowding undoes the good the windows are meant to do. Every measurement in this room, in other words, every foot of open floor and every pane of glass, exists because someone, somewhere, believed it would keep you alive. Whether they are right, for the reasons they think, is a question this ward is not yet equipped to answer. Between the windows, iron bed frames stand in 2 long facing rows, 30 of them by your rough count, each one identical to the last, narrow, black-painted, a thin straw mattress beneath a single grey blanket, a small chalk slate hanging from a hook at the footrail, where a name, a number, and a single word of instruction can be written and rewritten as needed. Yours is being written even now by the sister who led you in handwriting so practiced it takes her only a few seconds. You do not ask what the word says. You will learn it eventually, the way you learn most things in this building, sideways, overheard, pieced together from fragments not meant for you. The ward itself has a name, painted in careful gold lettering on a small board above the door. The name of a saint or a long-dead benefactor whose donation once paid for the building itself. The kind of name that will outlive every patient who ever passes beneath it, and most of the staff besides. Somewhere in this hospital there are a dozen wards just like this one, each with its own name, its own sister, its own particular character, quietly shaped by whichever illnesses tend to fill its beds. A fever ward, a surgical ward, a ward reserved on the better floors for children. Yours tonight is simply the one with an empty bed, which in the end is the only qualification that mattered. At the near end of the room, close enough to the door to see everyone and everything, stands a plain wooden desk, and behind it, a chair that is rarely empty for long. This is the sister's post, not merely a place to sit, but the true center of gravity for everything that happens in this ward between now and morning. From here, the rhythm of the room is set and kept. A bell, rung twice a day, marks the beginning and end of visiting hours, on the few days each week when visitors are permitted at all. A second, smaller bell announces meals, carried down the row on a wheeled trolley by an assistant nurse too junior to have a proper title yet, ladling out broth and bread to whichever patients are strong enough to sit up and take it. A third signal, not a bell at all, just the particular quality of silence that falls over the desk each evening, marks the hour when the lamps are turned low, and the ward, as much as 30 frightened strangers sharing one room ever truly can, is expected to sleep. You will come to know these signals better than you know the hours of your own former life. The full shape of a day here, you will learn only gradually, one signal at a time, but its outline is already visible in the ward around you tonight. Mornings begin early, before 6, most nights, though tonight is already too far advanced for that to matter, with a round of washing conducted bed by bed, a basin and cloth carried down the row by whichever nurse is least occupied elsewhere. Breakfast follows soon after, bread and a thin gruel for those too weak to manage anything firmer. The physicians make their rounds mid-morning, moving in a small procession from bed to bed, trailed by students who take notes on cases they will discuss again later, in rooms you will never see, in terms you would not entirely understand if you heard them. Dinner, the heaviest meal of the day, comes at midday. A lighter tea follows in the late afternoon, and then, as the light fails, the ward folds itself down towards sleep, exactly as it is folding now, lamp by lamp, bed by bed, until only the sister's own small light remains. It is, in its way, a kind of mercy, this relentless, unvarying structure. In a room full of people uncertain whether they will live to see the following week, the schedule itself becomes something to hold on to. The bell rings, the trolley comes, the lamps dim. Whatever else may be uncertain in this building, the shape of the day itself is not. Your bed, when you are finally led to it, sits roughly halfway down the row, beneath one of the tall windows, close enough to the draft that you can already feel it moving across the back of your neck. The sheets are clean but thin, tucked with a precision that suggests habit rather than comfort. The straw mattress beneath them shifts and settles unevenly as you sit, molded, faintly, by whoever occupied it last. You do not ask who that was. There is a particular etiquette, unspoken but universally understood in a room like this one, that certain questions are simply not put into words. To your left, an old woman lies propped against two pillows, awake despite the hour, watching you settle in with an expression that is neither unkind nor especially warm. The look of someone who has seen a great many new arrivals in this bed and has learned not to invest too much curiosity in any of them until they prove they intend to stay. A cough moves through her every few minutes, deep and wet, doubling her forward each time before releasing her again. Between coughs, she breathes carefully, shallowly, the way people breathe when they have learned that breathing too deeply comes at a cost. She has been here, you will learn before the night is through, longer than anyone else currently in this ward. Long enough that the younger nurses have stopped asking after her condition and started simply asking after her comfort instead, which is its own kind of answer if you know how to hear it. She does not tell you her diagnosis, and you do not ask. But you notice, as the hours pass, that she keeps a square of clean linen folded beneath her pillow, and that she uses it quickly and privately whenever the coughing is at its worst, folding it away again before anyone else can see exactly what it holds. It is a small, ordinary gesture. It will mean more to you later than it does tonight. When the assistant nurse comes round with the evening trolley a second time, not the meal trolley now, but a smaller one, bearing a row of corked bottles and a stack of shallow measuring cups. The old woman accepts her dose without being asked twice, tipping it back in a single practiced motion, the way a person swallows something they have long since stopped believing in, but have not yet found the will to refuse. You will learn in time exactly what fills those bottles, and exactly how carefully, or how carelessly, the measures inside them are weighed. Tonight, you know only that it is bitter, that she grimaces at the taste every single time, and that she takes it anyway, every single time, because a small, uncertain comfort is still a comfort, and there is precious little else on offer in this room after dark. 2 beds down, on the opposite side of the aisle, a boy no older than 12 lies with one leg bound stiffly from ankle to hip in wooden splints and linen wrapping, propped at an angle that looks uncomfortable and is, by his own cheerful account, considerably less painful than it appears. He fell, he tells you, without waiting to be asked, from the roof of his family's coal shed 3 days ago, chasing a cat that had no business being up there in the first place. He recites the story with the particular pride of a boy who has already told it a dozen times and has each version slightly more heroic than the last. The break was clean, the surgeon told his mother, and clean breaks in a boy his age meant well. He shows you, with some ceremony, the two wooden splints holding his leg in place, and explains, in the confident tone of someone repeating exactly what he overheard an adult say, that he'll be walking again inside 6 weeks, provided nothing goes wrong. Provided nothing goes wrong. He says it lightly, the way children repeat phrases whose full weight they have not yet learned to carry. You will hear those same 4 words again before this story is finished, spoken with considerably less lightness by considerably older voices. His mother visits twice a week, on the days the bell permits it, and has already, in 3 short days, become something of a fixture at the end of his bed, bringing news of the coal shed, the cat, a younger sister who cried for an entire afternoon when she heard he'd fallen. He recounts all of this to you secondhand, with the easy confidence of a boy who has not yet been taught to be afraid of hospitals, who sees this room not as a place of danger, but as a strange, temporary adventure with unusually attentive company and considerably less schoolwork than he is accustomed to. It is, you will come to notice, a kind of luck all its own. Not every patient in this ward still has the innocence left to see it that way. For now, though, the ward settles into something almost peaceful. The meal trolley makes its final pass of the evening. The old woman's coughing softens, gradually, into something closer to rest. The boy, tired from the effort of telling his story twice, drifts towards sleep, somewhere in the middle of a sentence about the cat. Outside the tall windows, the rain that followed you here all evening has finally begun to ease, leaving only the sound of it dripping, slow and irregular, from the guttering above. The sister rises from her desk as the light begins to fail and makes her way, unhurried, down the length of the ward. Bed by bed, checking a pulse here, straightening a blanket there, exchanging a few quiet words with a patient too anxious to sleep without them. She does this every evening at roughly this same hour, and will do it again tomorrow and the evening after that, for as long as this ward exists, and she remains its sister. It is not written in any manual you will ever see. It has simply become, through years of repetition, the shape this room takes at the end of every single day. One lamp dims, then another, then a third, until only the lamp at the sister's own desk still burns with any real strength, casting her shadow long and steady across the floor, between the rows. You lie beneath the thin blanket, the draft still moving faintly across your skin. The old woman's breathing settled now into something slow and even beside you, the boy's splinted leg propped at its careful angle, 2 beds away. Somewhere in the walls of this building, in rooms you have not yet seen, physicians are making rounds, an apothecary is measuring doses by lamplight. And somewhere further still, in a room reserved for exactly this purpose, a surgeon is likely, even now, preparing for tomorrow's operations. None of that reaches you tonight. Tonight, there is only the window and the draft, and the particular, careful quiet of 30 strangers breathing the same moving air. Somewhere down the row, a bed spring creaks. Somewhere else, someone murmurs a name in their sleep that no one nearby recognizes. The rain has stopped entirely now, and in its place, faint through the tall glass above you, comes the low, ordinary sound of the city continuing on without you. Cartwheels on wet cobbles, a distant bell marking some hour that no longer quite applies to you a world outside these windows that has not paused for a single moment to notice you have left it. You close your eyes. The draft moves once more across your face, patient and unhurried, doing whatever it is these windows were built to do, carrying away, or so its architects believed, whatever this room has breathed out today, making space for whatever tomorrow will bring instead. Beside you, the old woman's breathing has finally settled into something close to sleep. 2 beds down, the boy murmurs something about the cat and falls silent again. You wait, along with everyone else in this room, to see what morning brings. You wake somewhere past midnight, not from a dream, but from the absence of one. The particular weightless surfacing that comes when a body too unsettled to rest properly drifts up out of sleep for no reason it can name. The ward is dark now, lit only by the sister's lamp at the far end and the faint grey wash of moonlight through the tall windows. For a moment, you think you are alone. Then you see her, not seated at her desk this time, but standing over a bed 3 rows down, one hand resting lightly on a patient's wrist, counting. She has not stopped moving, as far as you can tell, since the moment you first saw her. It is not yet clear to you whether she ever does. You watch her for a long moment before she notices you are awake, and in that unobserved stretch of time, you find yourself doing something you had not expected to do tonight, really looking at her the way you might look at a piece of the building itself, something you had assumed until this moment was simply part of the ward's furniture, rather than a person carrying her own private exhaustion through hours no one will ever ask her about. This is the part of the hospital that has no name on any plaque above any door, and no mention in any of the annual reports the subscribers read over their breakfast. It happens in the dark, one small task at a time, performed by women. The century has largely agreed not to think about too closely. There is no formal training behind what you are watching, not here, not yet, and not for most of the women currently working this ward or any other like it across the city. A nurse in this decade is, more often than the hospital governors would care to admit, drawn from the same rough population she is meant to be caring for. Former patients themselves, in many cases, women who recovered in a bed like yours and stayed on afterward, because the work was there and little else was. There are no examinations to pass, no diploma to earn, no uniform course of instruction beyond whatever a sister chooses to teach the women beneath her, ward by ward, largely by example. What a nurse learns, she learns by watching, and by making mistakes small enough not to cost a life, and by being corrected sharply when she does not. Consider what this actually means, set against the work itself. A woman with no more medical knowledge than can be absorbed by standing near enough to a physician's rounds to overhear his instructions is nonetheless expected to recognize the difference between a fever that will break on its own and one that will not, between a wound healing cleanly and one already beginning to turn, between a patient who needs only rest and one who needs a doctor summoned from his bed in the middle of the night. Whatever the cost to her own standing, if she is wrong, she carries this judgment alone for most of every shift, because the physicians attached to this ward are not, as a rule, present within it after their morning rounds are finished. Whatever happens between one sunrise and the next belongs, in practice, if not in any official sense, to her. It is not a flattering picture, and the century has not been kind about painting it. Popular fiction of the day has already given the world its most famous nurse, and she is not this one. a red-nosed, gin-scented caricature named Sarah Gamp, forever dozing in her chair while her patients suffer, forever more interested in her own comfort than theirs. She is a joke told at nursing's expense, repeated so often in print and conversation alike, that many who have never set foot in a hospital ward believe her to be simply what a nurse is. There is enough truth scattered through the exaggeration to keep the joke alive. Drunkenness among hospital nurses is a real and frequently documented problem in this era, born as much from exhaustion and despair as from any want of character, in work that offers long hours, minimal pay, and almost no respect in exchange for handling the worst hours of strangers' worst days. Consider for a moment what the work actually asks of the women who do it, stripped of the joke entirely. A shift that rarely runs shorter than 12 hours, and often runs to 24, with no formal allowance for rest built into the middle of it. A body kept standing, walking, lifting, for nearly the whole of that time, in a ward whose temperature the open windows keep deliberately, permanently cold. Hands chapped raw from carbolic soap and cold water, chilblains blooming across knuckles by midwinter, backs bent from years of leaning over low beds, never designed with the nurse's comfort in mind at all. And beneath all of it, the particular cumulative weight of watching people die, not once, not twice, but as a near weekly fact of the work, absorbed and set aside and absorbed again, with no acknowledgement anywhere in the hospital structure. That grief of that kind might need somewhere to go. Is it any wonder, then, that some among them reached for a bottle to get through it? The wonder, if there is one to be found in this ward tonight, is how many did not. And yet, watch her for long enough, this sister on this ward tonight, and the caricature begins to fray at the edges. She has been on her feet, by your rough count, for something close to 18 hours. She will be on them for several more before another woman relieves her. Her wages, if she is fortunate enough to work in one of the better-run wards of the city, might reach £20 a year, a figure that has been slowly, unevenly climbing for decades, up from something closer to £8 a generation ago, though still barely enough and considerably less than what a skilled housemaid could expect from a wealthy family, for work that asks her to sit through fevers, hold basins for the dying, and carry the particular weight of watching people not survive the night again and again without ever quite being permitted to grieve any one of them for long before the next bed needs her. Some hospitals, this one among the fortunate few, have already begun to notice. A handful of matrons across the city, quietly without waiting for permission from the physicians who still consider nursing beneath their real attention, have started doing something almost nobody thought to do before, insisting that their nurses be sober, punctual and clean, and dismissing without ceremony those who are not. They have begun removing the most menial tasks, the laundry, the scrubbing, the endless carrying of coal, from the nurses' duties entirely, handing them instead to separate domestic staff, freeing the nurses themselves to focus on the patients alone. Board and lodging, once a privilege granted grudgingly if at all, is beginning to be offered as a matter of course on the theory, radical for this decade, that a nurse who is fed and housed properly makes fewer of the small, costly mistakes that an exhausted, half-starved one cannot always avoid. It is not yet a movement with a name. It will be before this decade is finished, though almost no one standing in this ward tonight could tell you exactly whose name history will eventually attach to it, or how thoroughly one famous reformer's fame will come to overshadow the quieter women who did this same work first, in wards, very much like this one, years before anyone thought to write it down. The sister, moving down this road tonight, has never heard of the woman whose name the whole of nursing will one day carry. She is, without knowing it, doing the same work anyway. For now, it is simply this: a woman standing over a bed at 2 in the morning, counting a stranger's pulse by lamplight, because someone has to, and because, for reasons that have very little to do with pay or recognition, and a great deal to do with something harder to name, she has decided that someone will be her. You watch her finish the count, make a small note, and move on to the next bed. The old woman beside you stirs at the sound of footsteps, coughs twice, quietly, and settles again without fully waking. The sister pauses at her bed a moment longer than the others, long enough to straighten the blanket, to touch the back of one hand briefly to the old woman's forehead, to glance, just once, at the small folded square of linen visible at the edge of the pillow before moving on without comment. She has seen it before. She will see it many more times before this particular story reaches its end. And you understand, watching her face in the low lamplight, that she already knows a great deal more about what it means than she has any intention of telling you tonight. At the next bed, a man you have not yet spoken with is caught somewhere between sleep and delirium, murmuring words that do not quite form sentences, his hands plucking restlessly at the edge of his blanket. He is younger than you expected fever to fall upon so hard. Perhaps 30, perhaps less, his face slick with sweat despite the ward's persistent chill, his lips moving through some private conversation with someone who is not, as far as you can tell, actually present in this room. The sister sits beside him without hesitation, takes one of those restless hands in both of hers, and speaks to him in a low, steady voice. Not urgent, not alarmed, simply present, the way you might speak to calm a frightened animal. You cannot make out the words from where you lie. You do not need to. There is a particular cadence to the kind of talking that is not meant to inform but simply to anchor. The same handful of phrases, repeated, unhurried, offered the way a hand is offered to someone standing at the edge of something. Within a few minutes, his hands still, his breathing slows, and he sinks back into something that might, at last, be actual rest rather than the thin imitation of it. The sister remains a moment longer than strictly necessary, watching his chest rise and fall, before rising herself and moving on to the next bed in the row. This, too, is nursing, though no textbook yet exists to teach it, and no examination could measure whether a woman possesses it or not. Near 3 in the morning, you watch her falter, just once, and only for a moment. She is mixing a dose at the small table by her desk, measuring a dark liquid from one of the corked bottles into a shallow cup, working by the single lamp still burning at that hour. Her eyes narrowed with the particular strain of reading a measure. She can no longer quite trust her own vision to read accurately. Her hand, for a fraction of a second, trembles enough that a few extra drops spill past the mark she has drawn with her thumbnail against the glass. She stops, stares at the cup, weighing something you cannot see in her expression. Whether the extra measure matters enough to start again, whether 18 hours of standing has cost her the steadiness this particular task requires. She tips the contents back into the bottle entirely, wipes the cup clean, and begins the measure again from the beginning, slower this time, her lips moving faintly as she counts. It costs her perhaps 90 extra seconds she can scarcely spare. She spends them anyway. You will wonder, more than once before this story is finished, how many nights like this one pass in wards across this city without a sister catching her own hand in time. You will wonder it again, with considerably more weight, before this particular story is over. By 4, the rain that stopped hours ago has apparently returned, though gently now. You notice it first, not through the windows, but through a steady, small dripping sound somewhere near the ward's far corner, where a section of guttering, worn thin by decades of London weather, has begun to leak onto the floor below in a slow, patient rhythm. The sister notices it too, glances toward it, makes a mental note you can see cross her face, and does nothing further about it tonight. There will be time to report it to the porter in the morning. For now, there are 30 patients and one of her, and a leaking gutter ranks somewhere well below a fevered pulse or a restless hand on her list of what deserves attention before dawn. It is the same rain, you realize, that followed you here in the carriage. It has simply found its own way inside at last, slower than you did, and by a much smaller door. A second woman appears briefly near the ward door, not long after. Younger, barely out of girlhood by the look of her, wrapped in a shawl against the corridor's chill, carrying a fresh supply of linen for the morning. She is a probationer, still learning the shape of this work under the sister's supervision, still young enough that her face has not yet settled into the particular composed stillness that marks everyone else moving through this ward tonight. She whispers something to the sister. A question by the shape of it, something about the man 3 beds down who was delirious earlier, and receives a brief, quiet answer in return before disappearing again down the corridor with her armful of linen. It is a small exchange, lasting perhaps 20 seconds. It is also, you will come to understand, exactly how this work has always been taught, long before anyone thought to put it in a book. One woman, watching another, learning by standing close enough to see. The ward settles by degrees into something close to true stillness. The delirious man sleeps. The old woman's cough has quieted to something almost peaceful. The boy, 2 beds down, has not stirred once since you last checked. One arm flung carelessly across his splintered leg in the unself-conscious sprawl of a child who has not yet learned to sleep carefully. And at her desk, in the last hour before the ward begins to wake around her, the sister finally sits. She does not intend to sleep. You can tell that much from the way she keeps her back straight, her hands folded rather than resting, the posture of someone still technically on duty. But the body has its own opinions about exhaustion, regardless of what the mind intends, and somewhere in the space of a few quiet minutes, her chin drops, just slightly, toward her chest, and her breathing slows into something too even to be anything but sleep. She does not fall. She does not even fully slump. She simply sits there, upright, asleep and not asleep, caught in the particular narrow margin between duty and collapse that women in her position learn to live inside for years at a stretch, ready, you understand, without being told, to snap awake again the instant any bed in this ward needs her. You lie awake a while longer, watching her sleep sitting up in a chair not built for sleeping, and find yourself thinking of the letter your family carried through 4 days of London rain to bring you here, of the governor whose signature made this bed possible, whose name is engraved somewhere on a brass plate in the entrance hall, whose charity will be remembered by this hospital long after tonight, is forgotten by everyone who lived through it. No plate anywhere in this building bears her name. No annual report will mention her by it. And yet, it is her hands, not his signature, that will decide whether you are still breathing in this bed by morning. Hers, and the trembling steadiness of a measuring cup at 3 in the morning, and a habit of catching her own hand before it costs someone something neither of you would ever fully understand. Somewhere above her, the gutter keeps dripping, slow and steady, into the grey hour before dawn. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, the city is beginning, almost imperceptibly, to stir. A cart somewhere in the distance, a first far-off bell, the particular quality of darkness that means morning, however reluctantly, is coming. She will wake before it fully arrives. She always does, and when the day nurses arrive to relieve her, she will walk home through streets not yet fully light, sleep for a few short hours in a narrow room, not unlike the ward she has just left, and return before dusk to do all of it again. Morning arrives the way it always does in this ward, not with sunlight, which the season and the smoke-choked sky above London rarely allow in any generous quantity, but with sound. A basin set down, a cough passed from bed to bed like a rumour. The particular scrape of the day sister's chair as she takes up the post the night sister has just surrendered, the two of them exchanging a few low words. A name, a number, a warning about someone whose fever climbed after midnight. Before the night sister gathers her shawl and disappears down the corridor, toward whatever thin daylight waits for her outside. You are washed, fed a thin gruel you do not much want, and propped a little higher against your pillow. By the time the sound reaches the ward that every patient in this room has learned, within a day or two of arriving, to recognize instantly, the particular cadence of many feet approaching together, unhurried, matched to a single pace. The physician has arrived. He does not enter so much as process. A small orderly column moving down the center aisle of the ward, himself at its head, a house surgeon a half step behind his right shoulder, and behind them both, trailing in loose formation, 5 or 6 young men in dark coats, notebooks in hand, none of them older than 25. They are students, attached to the hospital for their clinical training, and this hour of the morning belongs to them nearly as much as it belongs to him. Though you would be forgiven, watching the deference in their postures, for assuming they had come simply to witness rather than to learn. Every bed in the ward straightens slightly as the procession passes. It is not commanded. It happens anyway, the way a room quiets when someone important enters it, whether or not anyone present could say exactly why. He is not a young man, this physician, and his authority in this room is total in a way that has nothing to do with the letters after his name and everything to do with the particular confidence that comes from 30 years of being the person a ward full of frightened strangers looks to for an answer. He acquired his degree, as physicians of his rank generally do, through years of university study. Latin, Greek, the classical texts of medicine, read and debated long before he ever laid hands on a living patient. It is a different training entirely from the apprenticeship that made a surgeon of the man who will operate 3 floors below this ward later today, or the herbal trade that made an apothecary of the man measuring doses in the dispensary. The physician's authority rests on theory, on diagnosis, on the trained eye rather than the trained hand, and it places him, whether the surgeons beneath him care to admit it or not, at the very top of the small, rigid hierarchy that governs everything that happens inside this building. It is worth pausing here on exactly what that authority is built from, because it is considerably less solid than the confidence with which he wields it. Much of what he was taught as a younger man still carries the shadow of an older system entirely, one that has dominated medicine for the better part of 2,000 years. The belief that the body is governed by 4 essential fluids, or humors, and that illness arises when they fall out of balance with one another. Bloodletting, once the near universal answer to almost any fever, has fallen sharply out of favor within his own working lifetime, though you will still see it prescribed occasionally this week for cases judged to call for it. Purging remains more common still, a dose calculated to empty the body of whatever is believed to be poisoning it from within. He does not think of himself as a man practicing an old and increasingly doubted theory. He thinks of himself as every physician in every era has always thought of himself, as a man practicing the most advanced medicine his century has yet produced. In this, at least, he is entirely correct. It says less about him than it does about how early into the story of medicine this hospital still stands. He stops at the first bed, asks a question, listens to the answer with an expression that gives away nothing at all, turns to the students. This, you will come to understand, watching case after case unfold down the row ahead of you, is at least half of what a ward round actually is. Not simply the treatment of the sick, but the teaching of the well. Young men who will one day stand where he stands now, learning less from any book than from watching him work, bed by bed, through the accumulated evidence of other people's suffering. There is no blood drawn for testing this morning, and no machine anywhere in this building that could look beneath the skin to see what is actually happening inside a body. What the physician has instead is his own trained observation, refined over decades into something that looks, to an untrained eye, almost like a kind of magic. He takes a wrist between 2 fingers and counts against his pocket watch, timing not just the speed of a pulse, but its particular quality, bounding or thready, regular or skipping, each variation meaning something specific to a mind trained to read it. He asks to see a tongue, examines its color and coating with the same careful attention a jeweler might give a stone, because a furred white tongue tells a different story than a dry red one, and both tell a different story still from a tongue that trembles when extended. He presses 2 fingers flat against a patient's chest and taps them sharply with the fingers of his other hand, listening to the particular quality of the sound that comes back. A technique barely a lifetime old, first discovered by an Austrian physician tapping on wine casks to judge how full they were, and adapted eventually to the altogether stranger project of judging what fills a human chest by the exact same method. Percussion, this is called, and it is only the second newest tool in his possession this morning. The newest hangs from a leather cord around his neck, brought out and pressed to the chest of a young woman 2 beds ahead of you. A simple wooden tube, no more elaborate than a short length of hollow cane, one end resting against her skin and the other against his ear. It is barely 30 years old as an instrument, invented by a French physician who found the old method, pressing his own ear directly to a patient's chest, too awkward and too indelicate to bear, particularly with women, and who noticed one day that children playing with a hollow stick could pass sound along its length as clearly as if they stood beside each other. What began as a folded paper cylinder, held together mostly by curiosity, has become, within this physician's own working lifetime, something close to a professional necessity. A physician who does not use one now risks his own reputation more than his patient's comfort. Newer models, still rare enough to draw a glance when one appears, carry sound through 2 tubes instead of 1. A binaural design, barely a few years old, expensive, and not yet trusted by every physician who could afford it. This one carries only the old design. It serves him well enough. He listens for a long moment, eyes fixed on some middle distance that has nothing to do with the ward around him, entirely absorbed in whatever sound is passing up that hollow wooden tube into his ear. Then he straightens, hands the instrument to the nearest student, and asks him to listen for himself and describe what he hears. The student's answer is hesitant, uncertain, clearly guessing at half of what he thinks he ought to be hearing. The physician corrects him, not unkindly, but without much patience either, and moves the instrument to a second student and then a third, each one taking his turn at the young woman's chest while she lies perfectly still beneath their hands, saying nothing, asked nothing, present in the exchange only as the site where the lesson is taking place. She is, for these few minutes, less a person than a specimen, a particularly instructive case of something the physician names aloud in Latin for the benefit of the notebooks now filling with hurried writing around her bed. No one asks whether she minds being discussed this way, in words she does not understand, as though she were not lying directly beneath the hands doing the discussing. It does not appear to occur to anyone in the procession that the question is worth asking. 3 beds further on, the tone shifts. An older man, grey-faced and barely responsive, receives a longer examination than most, the physician's hands moving over his abdomen with unusual care, pressing gently, watching the man's face for some flicker of pain. He is too weak to voice clearly. The questions asked of the house surgeon afterward come faster, more clipped, and the notebooks around this particular bed fill with rather more writing than they did at the last. You cannot follow the Latin any more here than you could before. But you do not need Latin to read the change in the room's temperature. The way the students straighten slightly, the way the physician's usual unhurried pace quickens by some small, almost imperceptible degree. Whatever verdict is being formed at that bedside, it is not the same unhurried patience he offered the young woman with the stethoscope. The procession moves on eventually, leaving the grey-faced man exactly as still as he was before they arrived, and you find yourself, without quite meaning to, counting the beds between his and your own. By the time the column reaches your own bed, you have had ample opportunity to watch this ritual repeat itself, bed after bed, with only minor variation. You know by now roughly what to expect. The house surgeon reads your name and case notes aloud from a small ledger. The same ledger, you realize, that the house surgeon at admission handed his own brief notes into 2 nights ago, before you ever set foot in this ward. The physician studies you for a moment, the same appraising look the porter gave you at the door and the sister gave you at the ward entrance, though his version carries a different weight entirely, backed by decades of having been right, often enough that no one in this building thinks to question him. He takes your wrist, counts. His fingers are cool and precisely placed, entirely impersonal, the touch of a man for whom this particular contact has long since stopped being about you specifically and become instead simply data. A number to be weighed against 1,000 other pulses, counted across a career considerably longer than your own life so far. Tongue, he says, and you extend it without being asked twice, because you have watched 6 patients do exactly this in the last quarter hour, and understand by now that it is not really a request. He presses the stethoscope's wooden end to your chest, cold even through the thin hospital gown, and asks you to breathe, slow, then deep, then to hold it entirely while he listens. The silence stretches longer than it did for the young woman 2 beds back. You watch his face for some sign of what he is hearing, some flicker that might tell you whether the sound passing up that hollow tube is good news or bad. You find nothing. His expression, trained by decades of exactly this moment, has been built specifically not to give anything away, to patients at least, if not always to the students waiting for his verdict. Again, he says, and you breathe again, and still his face tells you nothing at all. He straightens at last and turns, not to you, but to the house surgeon beside him, and begins speaking in the low, clipped shorthand of men who have discussed 10,000 cases together and no longer need full sentences to understand one another. Words drift past you that you half recognize and cannot quite assemble into meaning. A note is made. The house surgeon nods. Only then, almost as an afterthought, does the physician turn back to you directly. "We shall watch and wait," he says. It is the same phrase, you will notice before the week is finished, that he offers to nearly every case whose outcome is not already obvious one way or the other. Not a diagnosis, not quite a reassurance, but a kind of practiced, professional patience dressed up to sound like a plan. You want badly to ask him what exactly he heard through that wooden tube pressed against your chest. You do not ask. Nobody in this ward asks. The physician's time belongs to 30 beds this morning, not one, and the particular etiquette of this room has already taught you, in less than 2 full days, that his verdicts are not generally opened to discussion. He turns to the next bed, before you have fully finished absorbing the sentence. The house surgeon lingers a moment longer, scratches a brief instruction onto a slip of paper, a preparation, a dosage, something for the apothecary's dispensary to make up before evening, and presses it into the hand of the ward's junior nurse, who tucks it into her apron pocket without reading it, and moves on to whatever the morning still requires of her. You are left as the procession continues down the road toward the old woman's bed, with nothing more solid to hold on to than 4 words and a slip of paper you will never see the contents of. Behind you, faintly, you hear the physician's voice again, discussing the old woman's case now in the same low, Latin-threaded shorthand, and you find yourself straining, uselessly, to catch some fragment of it. Some word you might recognize, some clue to what 4 days of watching that folded square of linen beneath her pillow has actually told him. You catch nothing. You think watching the backs of 6 dark goats move steadily away from you, of the grey-faced man 3 beds down, and the particular quickening in the physician's pace that no Latin was required to understand. You think, too, of the young woman whose chest was passed from student to student, like a lesson in a textbook, and of your own 4 words, watch and wait, offered with exactly the same unhurried calm the physician gave to every case in this ward that has not yet declared, one way or another, which direction it intends to go. You do not know, lying here, which kind of patient you are. Neither, in truth, does he. The difference is that he has learned, over 30 years, to let you believe otherwise. The column moves on, bed by bed, toward the far end of the ward, growing smaller and quieter with distance, until it is simply 6 dark coats moving through the grey morning light, carrying with them whatever certainty this building still believes itself to possess. Somewhere behind them, a slip of paper folded into an apron pocket makes its own quiet way down a back stair toward a small room lined with bottles and drawers, where a very different kind of medical man is about to begin his own morning's work. The slip of paper travels quickly once it leaves the ward, down a back stair too narrow for the grand processions above, past a linen store and a coal cellar, into a low-ceilinged room at the rear of the building, where the air smells of nothing you have encountered anywhere else in this hospital. Not carbolic soap, not vinegar, not the close human warmth of the ward, but something drier and sharper and altogether more vegetable. The smell of ground root and dried leaf and spirit held in glass. This is the dispensary, and the man standing at its long wooden counter, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a small brass balance resting on the scarred surface before him, is about to become, for the next quarter hour of your life, considerably more important to your recovery than either the physician who examined you this morning or the sister who has watched over your bed since you arrived. He is not, by the strict hierarchy of this building, a particularly grand figure. Where the physician's authority rests on a university degree and the surgeon's on the confident violence of his trade, the apothecary occupies a lower, humbler rung entirely. Trained not through lecture halls, but through 5 long years of apprenticeship, at least 6 months of it spent working the wards of a hospital, very much like this one, learning to recognize by sight and smell and taste the raw materials that will eventually pass through his hands as finished remedies. In an earlier generation, a man in his position might have served as something closer to a general practitioner himself, prescribing as well as preparing, treating minor wounds and common ailments for a fee. A one-man medical service for those who could not afford a physician's consultation. That role is narrowing now, year by year, as the profession sorts itself into tidier categories. But something of the old breath remains in him still, in the quiet confidence with which he reads the house surgeon's order and begins, without consultation or hesitation, to assemble what it asks for. Watch him for a while, and the room itself begins to feel less like a workshop than something closer to a chapel. Orderly, hushed, arranged entirely around the ritual of precision. Along the walls, floor to ceiling, stand rows of labeled jars and drawers, each one holding some portion of the raw vegetable kingdom reduced to a form the body can absorb. Dried chamomile and horehound for the gentlest complaints, wormwood and valerian root for the digestion, tinctures of belladonna and foxglove measured out with particular caution, because the same plant that eases a labored heart can, in careless hands, stop one entirely. Higher still, on shelves, reached only by a short wooden ladder, kept leaning permanently against the far wall, sit the jars reserved for the most potent preparations of all. Opium in its raw resinous form, brought from across the sea and processed here into the tinctures that fill half the bottles on the counter below. Powdered digitalis, distilled from the foxglove growing in beds not 50 yards from where you lie. Small paper twists of calomel, mercury compounded into a powder white and innocuous looking enough that nothing about its appearance would warn an untrained hand of what it actually contains. Each jar bears a label in the same neat hand, and beneath many of them a second smaller mark, a private code, understood only by the apothecary and whichever assistant he eventually trains to succeed him, noting which preparations demand double-checking before they ever leave this room. Many of these preparations began their life not on some distant plantation, but in the hospital's own small physic garden, tended through the warmer months by an assistant whose entire job, in season, is coaxing medicine out of soil. What cannot be grown is bought, dried, crowned, and stored in careful rotation, the older stock always dispensed first, nothing wasted, nothing allowed to sit so long. Its potency drifts unpredictably from what the label still claims. At the center of it all sits the balance, a small, exquisitely sensitive instrument kept always in its own glass case when not in use, calibrated to weigh out quantities most people in this century have never had reason to imagine. The apothecary's entire trade runs on measurements almost too small to picture. A pound divided not into the 16 ounces of the kitchen scale, but into 12. Each ounce into 8 drams, each dram into 3 scruples, each scruple, smallest and most exacting of all, into 20 single grains. A grain of opium in the wrong hand or the wrong body is the difference between a night's rest and a night that does not end. He weighs in grains the way another man might weigh in pounds, because at this scale, in medicines this potent, a small enough error can undo an entire physician's careful diagnosis in a single dose. He works, this morning, entirely by feel and long habit, one hand adjusting the small brass weights on one pan of the balance, the other tipping powder from a folded paper with the barest tremor of motion, watching the needle settle, adjusting again, watching it settle once more, until the 2 pans hang in perfect, silent agreement with each other. This entire system of measurement, grain, scruple, dram, ounce, pound, belongs officially, by act of law, to this decade and no further. It has governed English medicine for longer than anyone now living can properly account for, and it will not survive many more years before a newer, tidier standard sweeps it away entirely, folded into the same broader system that already weighs out flour and coal and every other ordinary commodity of the age. For now, though, it remains the language this room speaks fluently, and the ward upstairs does not speak at all. A private vocabulary of scruples and drams that separates as precisely as the Latin on the physician's order slip, separates him from his patients, the men who prepare medicine from the men and women who simply take it on faith. The order in his hand, like nearly every order that passes through this room, is written in the same clipped Latin shorthand the physicians use among themselves upstairs. Abbreviations for how much, how often, by what method the remedy is meant to be taken. A private professional language that excludes, by design, the very patients it is written to help. He reads it without difficulty, the way you might read a note from an old friend whose handwriting has long since stopped requiring conscious effort to decipher, and begins assembling, ingredient by ingredient, exactly what it asks for. Much of what leaves this room today and every day carries opium in one form or another, and there is no particular secrecy about this fact, no sense among the physicians or the apothecary himself that anything unusual or troubling is taking place. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, a thin, reddish-brown tincture kept in generous supply along the back wall, is dispensed for pain, for coughs, for sleeplessness, for the particular restless suffering that has no more specific name than distress. A patent preparation called Godfrey's Cordial, opium mixed with treacle and water and sold under the comforting name of Mother's Friend, is spooned into fretful infants across the city by mothers who have no access to this dispensary at all, and no better guidance than a chemist's shop counter and an advertisement's confident promises. Newer compounds are beginning to appear on these very shelves, blending opium with chloral hydrate, and in the most fashionable preparations, a tincture of cannabis, marketed to cure everything from a cough to a cramp to a case of nerves too delicate to name more precisely. Comfort and danger in this room are very often simply two names for the identical bottle, distinguished only by the hand measuring what comes out of it and the care with which that hand has been trained. It is not carelessness exactly that makes this arrangement possible. It is simply the honest limit of what this century's medicine has to offer. There is no other reliable answer in this decade for pain that will not otherwise ease, or coughing that will not otherwise stop, or the particular unraveling despair of a body too sick to rest. Opium is not the best answer available. It is, very often, the only one. Beyond these bottles sit others whose purpose is quieter still and rarely spoken of directly. Remedies compounded for what the physicians of this era call, with varying degrees of precision, female troubles, preparations offered for the pains of childbirth, the disruptions of monthly courses, and the broader, vaguer category of nervous complaint that some physicians insist afflicts women disproportionately by their very nature. Whether the affliction is always as real as the remedy is another question this dispensary is not equipped to answer, and not one the apothecary spends much time considering. His task is simpler and narrower than diagnosis. Someone upstairs has decided what is needed. His task is only to measure it correctly. Alongside the tinctures, older remedies persist as well, echoes of the same humoral thinking that still occasionally sends a physician's order down for bloodletting or a vigorous purge. A preparation of calomel here, a dose of senna there, medicines designed less to comfort than to empty the body of whatever imbalance is presumed to be causing its distress. The apothecary prepares these without particular enthusiasm and without particular doubt either. It is not his place to question a physician's order, only to fill it correctly, and correctly this morning means precisely what the slip of paper says, and nothing more or less. He has seen calomel prescribed for complaints as different from one another as a fever and a toothache, has watched it darken a patient's gums and loosen teeth in its wake when given too liberally over too many days, and has said nothing about any of it beyond what the order asked him to measure. Some lessons in this trade are learned only by watching consequences arrive weeks after the dose that caused them. Too late, by then, for the apothecary's own quiet doubts to matter to anyone but himself. For your own case, the order calls for something gentler. A small quantity of laudanum, carefully measured, to be given this evening for pain, and to encourage the rest that yesterday's admission and this morning's examination have both, in their different ways, made difficult to come by. He measures the tincture into a small corked vial with the same unhurried precision he brings to everything else in this room, holding the vial at eye level against the window's grey light to check the level against a thin painted line, adjusting by a drop, checking again. Satisfied, he seals it and writes on a small paper label, in handwriting considerably plainer than the physician's Latin, the ward, the bed number, and the hour it is meant to be given. He does not know your face. He will very likely never see it. And yet the car in his hands, measuring out precisely this much and no more, is in its own quiet way as personal an act as anything the physician performed at your bedside this morning. A stranger, 3 floors below you, doing his level best to get exactly right, the one small thing within his power to control. There is something almost meditative in watching him work, a slowness that has nothing to do with hesitation and everything to do with respect for exactly how much can go wrong at this particular scale of measurement. Upstairs, the ward moves at the pace of fear and uncertainty. Down here, for a few quiet minutes, everything moves at the pace of care. An errand boy, barely into his teens, collects the finished vial along with several others prepared for different wards this same hour, arranges them carefully in a shallow basket lined with cloth, and sets off back up the narrow stair. The order first travel down. By the time the boy reaches your ward, the afternoon light has shifted noticeably, the grey of morning giving way to the flatter, dimmer grey of an English afternoon, already contemplating its own early dusk. He hands the basket to the ward's junior nurse, recites the wards still remaining on his rounds, and disappears again down the corridor, already moving on to whatever comes next in a day built entirely from such small, careful deliveries. Your own vial reaches you not long before the evening meal, delivered by the same nurse who whispered a question to the night sister some hours earlier, back when this whole night still felt considerably longer than it has since come to feel. She measures out a small dose into a shallow spoon, checks it once against the label, and offers it to you with the same brisk, practiced gentleness you have come to recognize as simply how things are done in this ward. The taste is bitter, faintly sweet beneath the bitterness, warm in a way that has nothing to do with temperature. Within the half hour, the persistent low ache that has followed you since the carriage begins gradually to soften at its edges. Whether this is healing or only its imitation, you cannot yet say, and neither, in truth, could anyone else in this building. It is, for tonight, enough. It is on this same round, basket now considerably lighter, that the nurse pauses at a familiar bed 2 rows down. The boy, splintered leg still propped at its careful angle, sitting rather more upright against his pillows than he managed even a day ago. An actual trace of color returned to a face that had looked on your first night here, somewhat too pale for comfort. He is arguing cheerfully with the nurse about whether he is well enough to be moved to a chair by the window, a request she declines with the practiced patience of someone who has fielded this exact argument from this exact patient at least once a day since his arrival. His splints, she notes approvingly while adjusting them, are holding well. The clean break the surgeon promised his mother appears, so far, to be living up to its promise. He catches your eye across the aisle and grins, the particular unguarded grin of a boy who has decided, on no more evidence than his own stubborn optimism, that he intends to be walking again well before his 6 weeks are through. Nearly a proper cripple, he tells you cheerfully, entirely without self-pity, holding up the splintered leg for your inspection as though displaying a prize rather than an injury. And you find yourself, despite everything the last 2 days have shown you, almost smiling back at him. It is a small thing, watching him. It costs you nothing to watch it, and yet something in you settles slightly at the sight. The quiet, unremarkable proof that recovery, in this building full of uncertainty, does sometimes simply happen, exactly the way the surgeon said it would. Below, in the dispensary, the apothecary works on, toward evening largely alone. The last of the day's orders assembled and dispatched. The balance returned to its glass case, the counter wiped clean of powder and spilled tincture. Before he leaves for the night, he draws toward himself a heavy cloth-bound ledger. the dispensary's own record, kept separately from anything the physicians or the hospital's governors will ever review. A private accounting of exactly what left this room today, in what quantity, for which ward, and at whose order. He dips his pen and begins to write. Unhurried, the same careful hand that labeled your vial, now recording it a second time for the permanent record. The date, the preparation, the grains and scruples measured out, bed by bed, patient by patient, an entire day of quiet, exacting care reduced to a single dense column of figures that no one outside this room will likely ever read. It is, in its own way, the truest diary kept anywhere in this hospital, not of triumphs or tragedies, but of doses, of grains, of the small, precise mercies one man in a low-ceilinged room measures out, one careful weight at a time, long after the wards above him have gone dark for the night. No physician will ever read this ledger, no governor will ever ask to see it, and no patient upstairs will ever know it exists at all. Tucked away as it is in a room most of them will never once set foot in during their entire stay. And yet it may be, when all is finished, the most honest record this building keeps of what actually happened inside it. Not the confident Latin diagnoses entered into the physician's own ward books. Not the tidy annual figures the governors present to their subscribers each year, but simply this: a column of names, a column of numbers, grain by grain, night after night, the unglamorous arithmetic of trying to ease what medicine cannot yet cure. The lamp on his counter burns a while longer, alone, before he finally banks it and climbs the same narrow stair the day's orders travel down, leaving the dispensary to its rows of silent jars and its own particular herb-scented quiet, until morning brings the next slip of paper, and the next, and the next. News moves through a ward the way it moves through any small enclosed world, sideways, unofficially, carried on the backs of remarks not quite meant to be overheard. By the time the morning trolley has made its second pass, you already know that an operation is scheduled for early afternoon, that the patient is a millwright brought in during the night with a leg crushed beneath a length of falling machinery, and that the surgeon assigned to the case is, by the general opinion of everyone in this ward who has ever watched him work, among the fastest hands presently practicing in the city. You will not see this next scene occur. No patient on this ward is permitted anywhere near the room where it happens. But it happens exactly as this hospital has seen it happen 1,000 times before. And it is worth witnessing all the same, because it is here, more than in any ward or dispensary, that this century's medicine displays both the very best and the very worst of what it currently knows how to do. You think, hearing the news pass down the row this morning, of the boy 2 beds from you and the surgeon who set his leg without ever once opening the skin. A different kind of case entirely, cleaner, simpler, the sort of injury this century already knows reasonably well how to mend. What is happening upstairs this afternoon belongs to a different category of medicine altogether, one where the outcome is decided in seconds rather than weeks, and where the difference between a good surgeon and a merely competent one can be measured, quite literally, on a pocket watch. The millwright is perhaps 40, broad-shouldered, grey, already threading through a beard he has clearly not had occasion to trim since the accident. His leg, wrapped now in blood-darkened linen from knee to ankle, was crushed cleanly enough that there is no real argument to be had about the outcome. The limb cannot be saved, and everyone who has examined it, from the admitting house surgeon to the senior man who will perform the operation himself, has said so within his hearing, plainly and without much softening. He has had the whole of one long night to absorb this fact. He absorbs it the way most patients in his position absorb it, with a kind of exhausted, resigned steadiness that looks, from a distance, almost like calm, and is, up close, something considerably more complicated than that. He has a wife somewhere across the river, sent for by a neighbor sometime before dawn, and a foreman who came by briefly this morning to say the machinery would be seen to, and his position, whatever recovery allows, would still be waiting for him. Neither of these facts changes anything about what will happen to him this afternoon. He is given, an hour before the appointed time, a small dose from the same dispensary that measured out your own vial 2 nights ago. Something to steady his nerves rather than dull his senses entirely, since the room he is about to enter has its own particular means of managing pain, considerably more thorough than anything a corked bottle could provide. By early afternoon, he is carried on a covered stretcher up a narrow flight of stairs toward a room most patients in this hospital will hear about only in whispers and never actually see. The operating theatre, a name that has always struck outsiders as strange, until they have witnessed, even once, exactly how accurate a name it is. It is built, quite literally, like a theatre. A small central floor, barely large enough for the operating table itself and the men who must work around it, rises on every side into steep, narrow tiers of standing room. Wooden risers packed shoulder to shoulder with medical students, dressers, visiting physicians, anyone with sufficient standing or sufficient nerve to have secured a place. A low iron rail separates the operating floor from the lowest tier, more a formality than a genuine barrier, close enough that a spectator in the front row could, if the fancy struck him, reach out and touch the table itself. On a busy operating day, upward of 100 spectators may crowd into a space built to comfortably hold perhaps half that number, craning for a clear view of the table below, close enough in the tightest galleries to smell exactly what is happening on it. A skylight far above provides what little natural illumination the room receives, supplemented on darker days by a ring of gas lamps positioned to throw as much light as possible directly downward, leaving the tiered galleries themselves in a kind of perpetual half-shadow, appropriate, perhaps, for an audience whose role today is to watch rather than be seen. The floor itself is strewn with fresh sawdust before every case, swept away and replaced after. A practical measure against the mess the coming hour will produce, and nothing more sophisticated than that. Along one wall, a table holds the instruments laid out in careful rows, knives of varying lengths, a bone saw, forceps, needles and silk thread for the ligatures that will close what the knife opens. The same instruments, unwashed between patients, that performed yesterday's operations and will perform tomorrow's, wiped clean of visible matter with a cloth kept for the purpose, and considered by every standard this decade currently recognizes perfectly sanitary. A wooden box of sand sits nearby, ready to be scattered across the floor, should the sawdust itself prove insufficient before the hour is through. Understand, before this operation begins, exactly how recently this room has changed, and how much, in one crucial respect, it has not. For the better part of this century, and for every century before it, a patient carried into a room like this one faced the operation entirely conscious, held down by 2 or 3 strong assistants, whose sole task was to keep a thrashing, screaming human being still enough for the knife to do its work. There was no shame attached to the screaming. It was simply expected, factored into the arrangement of the room itself. Assistants chosen as much for their physical strength as their medical knowledge, positioned specifically to pin shoulders and legs against a table built sturdy enough to withstand exactly this kind of struggle. Surgeons were prized above every other quality for speed, not out of impatience but out of genuine mercy, because every additional second on the table was a second of unmediated agony for the person strapped to it. A patient facing an amputation in the years before this decade might spend weeks beforehand simply dreading the appointed hour, a dread that visiting clergymen and family members alike understood as its own particular form of suffering, deserving of comfort in its own right, quite apart from whatever came after. The most celebrated surgeon of this era, a Scotsman whose reputation as the fastest blade in the city has become something close to legend among the students packed into these galleries today, could reportedly remove an entire leg in under 30 seconds, incision to final stitch. A feat of raw physical speed that saved his patients an almost unimaginable quantity of suffering. Whatever else might be said about the wisdom of moving quite that fast with a knife in a crowded room, and whatever the occasional cost to an assistant's own fingers, caught once or twice over the years in the path of a blade moving faster than anyone in the gallery could quite follow, that same surgeon, only a handful of years ago, performed something that changed this room more completely than anything since it was built. In December of 1846, word reached London of an American dentist's discovery. A vapor called ether, inhaled through a soaked sponge, that rendered a patient entirely insensible to pain for the length of an operation. Skepticism ran deep at first. More than one physician in this city dismissed the whole idea as a passing curiosity, unlikely to hold up under the genuine violence of major surgery, and newspaper accounts of patients dying under its influence did little to ease the doubt. It held up all the same. Within the year, a gentler successor had arrived as well. Chloroform, discovered by an Edinburgh physician, experimenting late one evening with compounds he and his colleagues were, by his own later account, testing on themselves and each other around the dinner table, until one by one they slid from their chairs and woke some while later on the floor, delighted rather than alarmed by what they had just demonstrated. It proved easier to administer than ether, faster acting, sweeter smelling, and free of the sponge's harsh, lung-irritating fumes. And it has since become, in operating theatres across the country, very nearly the standard of care. Endorsed, most persuasively of all, by the Queen's own physician administering it to Her Majesty during childbirth some years past, a fact repeated in this theatre, and 100 others like it whenever a nervous patient needs reassurance that the vapour about to be given them is respectable enough for royalty. It is, without question or exaggeration, one of the great mercies this century has produced. What it has not solved, what almost no one standing in these galleries today has yet begun to properly understand, is everything that happens after the patient wakes up. The millwright is laid on the table, and a small cloth cone soaked in chloroform is held near his face by an assistant whose entire job this afternoon is measuring exactly how much vapor a body this size requires, and exactly when the breathing beneath the cone has slowed into the particular rhythm that means unconsciousness has arrived. It is a delicate calculation, more art than science even now. Too little, and the patient wakes partway through. too much, and the vapor itself becomes the danger. A possibility every surgeon in this room has heard whispered about in connection with some case or another, though rarely one they witnessed themselves. It takes less than 2 minutes. His hands, which had been gripping the table's edge with white-knuckled tension moments before, loosen and fall still. His face, tight with the particular anticipatory dread of a man who has spent the whole night being told exactly what is about to happen to him, relaxes into something disturbingly close to peaceful sleep. The silence that follows is the strangest part of all, stranger in its way than anything the knife is about to do. A room built for screaming has, in the space of a single generation, become a room that does not need to hear any. The surgeon steps to the table, sleeves rolled, coat unchanged from the one he wore examining 2 other patients this same morning, its front marked with the particular dark staining that every man in his position accumulates, and none apparently thinks worth the delay of changing between cases. 2 assistants take their positions, one to steady the limb, the other ready to hand instruments the moment they are called for, and a third stands by simply to keep count of the minutes, because a surgeon's reputation in this room is built as much on the clock as on the outcome. He works quickly, exactly as his reputation promises. The galleries above lean forward as one, 100 pairs of eyes tracking hands that move with an economy of motion built from hundreds of repetitions before this one. There is no dwelling here on the particulars of what those hands are doing. Only the fact of their speed, the low murmur of the surgeon's own voice calling instructions to his assistants, the controlled, businesslike urgency of men who have done this before and will do it again before the day is finished. The saw's brief, unmistakable sound cuts through the theater's hush exactly once, precisely as long as it needs to be, and not a moment longer. Somewhere below 30 seconds, by the reckoning of students counting under their breath in the nearest gallery, the limb is free of the body it once belonged to. The remaining minutes are given over to the ligatures, silk thread tied off, one vessel at a time, against the bleeding that speed alone cannot prevent. And then finally, to the dressing that will, everyone in this room sincerely hopes, hold the wound clean and closed until it has the chance to heal. A ripple of something like applause moves through the upper galleries as the surgeon steps back from the table, not for any single dramatic flourish, but simply for the fact of it being finished, cleanly, quickly, by a man whose skill every student watching hopes someday to match. Notebooks fill rapidly in the tiers above, students racing to record not just what they saw, but the precise timing of it. A detail every one of them understands will matter enormously to their own careers, whether or not it matters half so much to the man now being lifted from the table. A senior student near the front row, close enough to have felt the faint spray of the saw's brief work, wipes his own coat sleeve with the particular unbothered efficiency of someone for whom this has already become, after enough repetitions, simply part of the job. In the anteroom outside, unseen by the millwright and unremarked upon by anyone in the galleries still discussing the operation just finished, a second patient waits on his own stretcher. A young laborer with a hand crushed in a factory press, his own turn perhaps 20 minutes away, listening, whether he intends to or not, to every sound that has just carried faintly through the theater's heavy door. The millwright is carried back down the narrow stair some while later, still deep in the chloroform's fading grip, unaware yet of what the last hour has cost him, and equally unaware, in this particular moment of any pain at all. A mercy that would have been entirely unavailable to him only a decade earlier, and one that every person who watched this operation understands, without needing to be told, represents genuine and extraordinary progress. He is settled into a bed in a ward much like your own, tended by a sister much like yours, the stump already beginning the long, uncertain work of healing beneath its fresh dressing. Word of the operation's success reaches your own ward before evening, carried the same sideways, unofficial way. The news of it first arrived this morning. The millwright came through it cleanly. The sister tells the old woman beside you, while checking her pulse, speed and skill, exactly as promised. And for a moment, the whole row of beds seems to exhale slightly, the way a ward does when a piece of frightening news resolves, for once, in the direction everyone was hoping for. Behind him, in the theatre itself, the instruments are gathered up and wiped down with the same cloth used after yesterday's cases. The sawdust swept and replenished, the table readied for whoever comes next. Because the millwright is not, this afternoon, the theatre's only patient. A second case waits already in the small anteroom outside, and the surgeon, still in the same unwashed coat, still working with the same unwashed instruments, will begin again within the half-hour, carrying forward from one patient's open wound to the next's, whatever neither he nor anyone watching from the galleries has any way of seeing, what none of them yet understand. Not the surgeon wiping his instruments with the same cloth he used yesterday, and will use again within the hour. Not the students filing back down to their own wards, already discussing what they witnessed. Not the millwright himself, sleeping now in a bed not unlike your own. Is that the operation itself was very likely the safest part of what is still to come. The knife has done its work cleanly, the wound is closed, the bleeding stopped, the patient alive and resting, by every measure this hospital currently knows how to take. The case is, this afternoon, a considerable success. Whether it remains one by the end of the week is a question this theatre, for all its speed and skill and genuine mercy, is not yet equipped to answer. You lie in your own bed that evening, turning the day's news over slowly, the way you have learned in your short time here to turn over most things this hospital shows you. Somewhere above you, a man is resting who, a decade ago, would have spent this same evening replaying in memory every second of an agony now spared him entirely. It is difficult, weighing that fact honestly, to call this century's medicine anything other than a genuine advance, swifter, kinder, more merciful by any measure a patient on that table could name. And yet something in the day's account sits uneasily with you all the same, though you could not, if pressed, say precisely why. Perhaps it is only the sawdust, swept and replenished between one patient and the next. Perhaps it is nothing at all. Sleep, when it finally comes, arrives before you manage to settle the question either way. 3 days after the operation, the millwright is doing well enough that the ward sister tending him has begun cautiously to speak of moving him from the fever bed nearest her desk to one further down the row. A small administrative gesture that means, in the private shorthand of every nurse in this hospital, this patient is expected to live. His color has returned. He has taken solid food twice. He has asked more than once when his wife might be permitted a longer visit and been told, not unkindly, to be patient a little longer yet. The house surgeon who checks his dressing each morning pronounces the wound on each occasion, to be healing exactly as a wound of this kind ought to heal. Clean edges, modest discharge, nothing in its appearance to trouble a trained eye. Word reaches your own ward as such word always does, sideways and unofficial. The millwright is expected to be up and using crutches within the fortnight. By the fourth day, something has changed. It begins, as it so often does, with almost nothing at all. A slight warmth to the skin around the dressing, noted by the sister during her morning round, and judged at the time unremarkable enough not to trouble the physician with. A fever that had been steadily falling ticks upward again by a degree, then two, dismissed at first as the ordinary unevenness of a body still recovering from shock. By the fifth day, it is not unremarkable any longer. The stump, unwrapped for its scheduled change of dressing, shows a discoloration no one on this ward particularly wants to name aloud, and a smell that reaches the nearby beds before the dressing is even fully removed, sweetish, faintly rotten, entirely unlike the clean iron scent of a wound healing as it should. The millwright himself, questioned gently about how he feels, reports only a persistent, dragging fatigue and a fever that seems, by his own account, to worsen a little more with each passing hour, rather than break the way an ordinary fever eventually does. His appetite, robust only a day earlier, has vanished entirely. He sleeps in short, restless stretches, waking each time damp with sweat and asking, in a voice growing steadily less steady, when the fever might finally be expected to pass. You have watched over your own days in this ward, a great deal of suffering absorbed calmly, almost routinely, by the staff who moved through it. This is different. You can see it in the particular quickness with which the sister sends for the house surgeon this time, and in the low, urgent tone she uses to summon him. Not the unhurried authority of a woman who has seen this exact thing many times before and knows precisely how it will resolve, but something closer to genuine alarm. The condition that has taken hold of the millwright's wound has several names in this hospital, depending on which physician you ask and which particular symptoms present themselves most prominently. Some call it hospital gangrene, some call it surgical fever, or simply pyemia, a Greek-derived term meaning, roughly, pus in the blood, used for cases where the infection appears to have traveled well beyond the original wound and taken hold somewhere deeper and more dangerous. Erysipelas is another name heard whispered along this corridor, a bright, spreading redness of the skin that sometimes accompanies the fever and sometimes appears entirely on its own. Whatever name is finally settled on for this particular case, the underlying reality is the same one that has haunted operating theaters across the city for as long as anyone can remember. A clean, technically successful operation, followed days later by an entirely different and far more dangerous battle, fought not against the injury that brought the patient here, but against something that arrived, invisibly, sometime after the injury was already being treated. No one in this building has ever seen the thing now killing him by inches. No one, in truth, has any clear idea what it actually is. There is, among physicians of this era, a belief that would strike a later century as almost impossible to credit, and yet is held here with complete and untroubled sincerity, that the discharge of pus from a healing wound is not a warning sign at all, but a good one. Laudable pus, the textbooks call it, evidence that the body is properly cleansing itself of whatever material the injury has disturbed. A wound that weeps cleanly is, by this logic, a wound doing exactly what a wound ought to do, and a surgeon inspecting such a wound in its early days often nods with something close to satisfaction at the sight of it. It is only when that same discharge turns foul, spreading, accompanied by the particular unrelenting fever now gripping the millwright, that anyone begins to suspect something has gone genuinely wrong, by which point, more often than any surgeon in this building would care to admit, it is already too late to reverse. The line between a wound healing correctly and a wound already lost is, in the vocabulary this century currently possesses, disturbingly difficult to draw in time to matter. Consider for a moment exactly how much this single misunderstanding has cost. Consider it from every angle, because it deserves more than a passing thought. Consider the surgeon who performed a technically flawless operation on the millwright. Hands steady, timing exact, every measure of skill this decade has to offer, brought to bear on a clean, well-executed amputation. Only to watch, days later, some invisible agent undo the whole of that careful work through a route no one in the room that afternoon had any means of detecting. Consider the instruments, wiped clean between one patient and the next, with a single cloth kept for the purpose, carrying forward on their blades whatever this invisible agent actually is, from case to case, unwittingly, all day, every day, in every operating theatre in this city. Consider the surgeon's own unwashed hands and his own unwashed coat, worn with something close to professional pride, its dark staining a kind of badge marking him as a man who has performed a great many operations, never once suspected, by him or by anyone standing in judgment of his skill, as a possible route by which one patient's suffering might be carried directly into the next patient's open wound. Consider, too, the sawdust swept and replenished on the theatre floor after every case, the same cloth used to wipe every table, the same water basin serving every pair of hands that passes through that room in a single working day. An entire architecture of care, built with real diligence and real intention, arranged almost perfectly to spread the one thing no one in the building yet knows to guard against. There is a statistic, quietly gaining currency among a handful of reform-minded voices in this decade, though not yet one the physicians of this hospital would readily accept as fact, that a patient undergoing surgery at home in an ordinary bedroom, attended by an ordinary physician, stands a markedly better chance of survival than the same patient undergoing the identical operation inside a crowded city hospital, the very institution built at considerable expense and considerable charity specifically to save him. The figures behind this claim, where anyone has troubled to gather them at all, are stark enough to unsettle even the most confident practitioner. Mortality rates in the largest, most crowded hospitals running several times higher than anything the underlying illnesses alone could reasonably explain. It is a deeply uncomfortable claim, precisely the kind of claim that a subscriber reading his hospital's annual report would prefer not to encounter, and precisely the kind of claim that the physicians who staff these wards have, for the most part, simply declined to examine too closely. 2 beds from the millwright's now empty one, a young clerk recovering from a straightforward hernia repair, watches his own dressing change the following morning with considerably more attention than he showed it the week before, asking the nurse twice whether the color looks right, whether the smell is as it should be, whether she is entirely certain. She answers him patiently both times and means every word of her reassurance. and cannot entirely blame him for asking a third time regardless. Fear, once it has found a foothold in a room like this one, does not confine itself politely to the bed where it began. The prevailing theory, when pressed, points toward foul air, toward the same miasma the tall windows of your own ward were built to disperse, toward overcrowding, toward the accumulated staleness of too many sick bodies sharing too little space for too long. It is not, strictly speaking, an unreasonable theory, given everything this century currently knows. It is also, though no one standing in this hospital today has any way of proving it, almost entirely beside the point. The truth, when it eventually arrives, will be smaller than anyone expects, and stranger. It will not be an odor. It will not be found in the air at all. It will be found, of all places, on unwashed hands, carried invisibly from patient to patient, from wound to wound, by the very men working hardest to heal them. None of that truth is available to anyone in this building today. What is available this evening is a ward sister sitting a great deal longer than usual beside a single bed near her desk, and a house surgeon returning twice within a few hours to check a fever that will not break, and a wife, sent for again, sitting now at her husband's side, with the particular stillness of someone who has stopped asking questions because she has begun quietly to understand the answers without needing them spoken aloud. You watch this unfold from your own bed further down the row, close enough to see and too far to help, exactly as you watched the sisters' exhausted vigilance 3 nights ago, and the physicians' clipped Latin verdicts the morning after that. This is simply what this ward shows you, when it shows you anything at all. Not one single terrible event, but the slow accumulation of many ordinary ones, each of them on its own almost bearable. You find yourself, without quite meaning to, running a hand along your own side, checking, the way you have checked every day since your admission, for warmth that should not be there, for a tenderness that feels different today than it felt yesterday. You find nothing. You are not entirely sure tonight whether that reassures you or simply postpones the question. The surgeon himself visits once, late in the evening of the 5th day. Still in the same dark coat you glimpsed briefly, discussed in ward gossip after the operation, though its bearing tonight carries none of the brisk confidence that filled the operating theatre 3 days before. He examines the wound in near silence, exchanges a few low words with the house surgeon, and orders what modest measures remain available. A change of dressing, a stronger dose from the dispensary, to ease what pain the fever allows through, cool cloths for the forehead, and little else, because little else is left to try. He asks, at one point, whether the wound has been kept as clean as possible since the operation, and receives the honest answer that it has. Cleaned, dressed, tended exactly as every wound in this hospital is cleaned and dressed, by hands and instruments that everyone involved sincerely believes to already be clean enough. It is a question with no useful answer available to anyone in the room, because the entire premise behind it, that cleanliness as this century understands it might not be nearly rigorous enough, sits just beyond the edge of what any of them currently know to ask. He does not linger. Whatever confidence carried him through 30 seconds of flawless surgery 3 days ago has no obvious application to the battle now being fought in this bed against an enemy his hands, however skilled, cannot cut away. You notice, watching him leave the ward, that he does not walk quite the way he did the afternoon of the operation. Not slower exactly, but heavier, the particular gait of a man carrying something he did not expect to be carrying tonight. He will operate again tomorrow. He will very likely operate well, but something in his bearing tonight suggests this particular case has cost him more than the millwright's leg, and will go on costing him for some while yet. The millwright dies a little before dawn on the 7th day, quietly, without the drama, his admission and his operation both carried in their own ways. Simply a fever finally winning a contest. No one in this building had the tools to referee fairly. The ward absorbs it the way it absorbs everything. A curtain drawn briefly around the bed, low voices, the particular hush that falls over 30 other patients who understand, without needing to be told, exactly what has happened 2 beds or 6 beds or 10 beds away from their own. His wife is with him at the end. By morning, the bed is empty, the linens changed, ready, within a day or two, for whoever the ticket system sends through the doors next. The old woman beside you, who has watched more of this than either of you has ever discussed aloud, says nothing for a long while after the news reaches your row, only reaches, out of habit rather than immediate need, for the folded square of linen still kept beneath her own pillow. Fear settles over the ward differently after a loss like this one than it did before. Quieter, more specific, no longer the general dread of illness in the abstract, but something closer to a particular unanswered question. Everyone in this room now carries a little more heavily than they did a week ago. The operation succeeded. Every measure of skill this century possesses was brought correctly to bear. And still, 7 days later, an invisible enemy that no one in this building has ever seen, and few would even know how to describe, has taken a man who should, by every visible standard, have walked out of here on 2 remaining legs and a great deal of gratitude. Not every physician in this city holds the miasma theory quite as tightly as the men working these wards. Elsewhere in London, a doctor investigating an outbreak of cholera some years past traced its source not to bad air at all, but to a single contaminated water pump, a finding that unsettled the prevailing wisdom of his own profession considerably more than it convinced it. His theory remains, in most respectable medical circles, a minority view. Interesting, worth noting, not yet worth reorganizing an entire hospital around. It will be some years still before anyone draws the fuller connection between his water pump, the surgeon's unwashed hands, and the invisible thing that took the millwright in the space of a single week. For now, his findings sit alongside 100 other half-understood observations, filed away, waiting for someone to notice how many of them are quietly pointing toward the same unspoken answer. What exactly is killing these people? It is the question this entire hospital has been circling since the moment you first passed through its doors, asked in different words by the ward's tall windows, by the sisters' careful measuring, by the physician's non-committal verdicts, by the apothecary's precise, grain-by-grain caution. Tonight, for the first time, it is asked plainly, by a ward full of frightened strangers who have just watched skill and mercy and genuine progress fail entirely, against something none of them can name. No one in this building has an answer yet. Somewhere else in this city, in a laboratory none of these physicians have ever visited, studying creatures none of them have ever heard of, someone is already beginning to find one. It will be years yet before that answer makes its way from the laboratory to this ward, years before the connection is drawn between an unwashed hand and a fever. No window, however tall, however well positioned, could ever hope to disperse. For tonight, there is only the empty bed and the sister's careful, unspoken vigilance over every other wound in this room, and a question that will keep circling this hospital unanswered for a while longer yet. You lie awake later than usual that night, listening to the particular quiet of a ward that has just absorbed a loss, and find your thoughts returning unexpectedly to the tall windows above your own bed, the ones you were told, on your very first night here, exist specifically to keep you safe. You do not doubt tonight that the men who built them believed entirely in what they were doing. You find yourself wondering all the same whether belief and correctness have ever been quite the same thing in this building or anywhere else, and whether anyone currently walking these corridors will live to see the difference finally explained. The days that follow settle slowly back into something resembling the ward's ordinary rhythm. The bell rings for meals. The trolley makes its rounds. The sister at her desk resumes the particular unhurried vigilance that carried you through your first night here, though you notice now a certain added carefulness in the way she checks each dressing, each brow, each forehead, a carefulness that was not quite so pronounced before the millwright's bed stood empty for a morning. Life in this room, you are beginning to understand, does not stop for grief. It simply folds grief in beside everything else it is already carrying, and continues. What this ward has shown you so far, the admission, the architecture, the nursing, the diagnosis, the medicine, the surgery, the invisible enemy that took a strong man in the space of a week, has mostly concerned itself with a single patient's single story, examined closely from as many angles as this building could offer. Tonight asks something gentler of you. Tonight asks you simply to sit quietly in the particular hush of a fever ward after dark, and listen to what fills so many of these beds night after night, with far less drama and far more simple, patient suffering than anything you have witnessed so far. Not every fever in this hospital arrives the way the millwrights did, sudden, traceable to a single afternoon, a single wound. Most arrive the way fevers have always arrived in a crowded city, slowly, from causes no one in this ward could name with any confidence, carried in on water, on breath, on the simple accumulated proximity of too many people living too closely together for too long. Elsewhere in London tonight, in wards not unlike this one, 3 particular fevers account for more admissions than almost anything else this century's medicine is asked to treat, and it is worth sitting with each of them a while, because between them they explain a great deal about why a hospital in this decade is still, for all its genuine mercies, such a dangerous place to need. The swiftest and most feared of the 3 arrived in this country only within living memory, and announced itself on its first appearance with a violence that left even experienced physicians shaken. Cholera does not linger politely. A person perfectly well at breakfast may be gravely ill by supper and dead before the following dawn. A progression so rapid, so merciless in its speed, that entire families have watched a healthy relative collapse and pass within a single turn of the clock, the illness announcing itself first as an urgent, unstoppable purging of the body, followed by a thirst that no amount of water seems able to satisfy, and finally, by a creeping bluish pallor that experienced nurses learn to recognize grimly as the beginning of the end. It first reached these shores by way of a northern port, spreading inland with a speed that outran every attempt to contain it, and has returned since in waves severe enough that this ward's own sister and every sister of her generation carries at least one memory of a summer when the fever beds simply never stood empty for more than an hour at a stretch. During the worst of the outbreaks that have swept this city over the past 2 decades, the weekly toll in London alone has run into the thousands. Entire streets emptied within a season, entire families reduced to a single surviving member by the time the epidemic finally burns itself out. For decades, the prevailing explanation pointed, as it so often does in this century, toward foul air rising from the slums and the river alike. One physician in this city has recently argued something different and something considerably harder to dismiss, that the illness traces not to the air at all, but to water drawn from a single contaminated pump in a crowded Soho street, its handle finally removed at his insistence, after which the surrounding outbreak, mapped house by house with the patients most of his colleagues have not troubled to match, simply stopped. It is a finding most of the profession still regards with polite skepticism. It is also, though no one in this hospital has yet drawn the connection, considerably closer to the truth than the miasma theory this ward's own tall windows were built to answer. A second fever fills nearly as many beds, and for most of this century has gone by the same name as a third, entirely different illness. A confusion so persistent that physicians treating both conditions side by side for generations genuinely believed themselves to be facing a single disease that simply presented itself differently from one patient to the next. Only within the last handful of years has a London physician, working carefully through case after case at a hospital built specifically for fever patients, begun to argue convincingly that typhus and typhoid are not variations of one illness at all, but two entirely separate diseases, distinguishable by the particular pattern each leaves behind in the body, and by the very different circumstances that seem to summon each one forth. His careful comparison of dozens of cases, published only recently, has begun circulating through the more attentive corners of the profession, though it will be some while yet before every physician in a hospital like this one has fully absorbed the distinction or reorganized his own thinking to match it. Typhus travels on lice, thriving wherever people are crowded together in unwashed clothing and unwashed conditions, prisons, ships, slums, the overcrowded lodging houses of the poorest quarters of this city, places where a single infested garment can carry the fever from one household to a dozen others within a matter of days. Typhoid travels differently, through water and food fouled by the very waste it eventually produces in its victims, indifferent to whether the household it enters is poor or comparatively comfortable, so long as the water reaching its kitchen has passed anywhere near what it should never have passed near at all, a fact that makes it, in its own quiet way, considerably more democratic in its choice of victims than almost any other disease this hospital treats. Both produce the same relentless climbing fever, the same delirium, the same faint rose-colored spots spreading across the chest that a careful eye can, with practice, learn to tell apart. For now, most physicians in this hospital still speak simply of continued fever, a catch-all term broad enough to cover an entire ward of genuinely different suffering, and narrow enough to obscure, for a while longer yet, exactly how differently each of these illnesses ought to be fought. And then there is the fever, that does not announce itself as a fever at all, most days, the slow, patient, wasting illness that fills more beds in this hospital, and in every hospital like it across the country, than cholera and typhus and typhoid combined. Consumption asks nothing sudden of the body. It does not arrive in a single violent night, the way cholera does, or climb toward crisis over a fortnight, the way the continued fevers do. It simply settles in, quietly, sometimes for months or years before anyone thinks to name it. A persistent cough, a certain paleness, a fatigue that seems disproportionate to whatever small effort provoked it. A slow, gradual thinning of a body that once carried more weight than it does now. There is, some have noted, an almost cruel beauty to its early stages, a pallor and a brightness of the eye that a certain kind of poetry has in recent decades mistaken for delicacy rather than disease, romanticized in verse and portraiture by people who have never once sat through a night, like the ones this ward knows intimately. By the time the coughing brings blood, as it eventually does in the cases that reach this ward, the disease has usually been present, quietly doing its patient work for far longer than anyone around the patient realized. It takes the young as readily as the old, more readily in fact. A disproportionate share of its victims are men and women in the full flush of youth, cut down in what ought to have been the most vigorous years of their lives. A pattern grim enough that some in the city have taken to calling it, with a kind of weary poetry, the robber of youth. Nearly a quarter of all deaths in this decade trace back to this single illness in one form or another, more than any other cause this century currently tracks. And yet, it inspires none of the visible public dread that cholera does, arriving as it does not in a single terrifying season, but as a constant, quiet undertone running beneath the ordinary business of the whole century. Whether it is hereditary, passed down through families the way certain other frailties are, or something else entirely. Something that might, however strange the notion currently sounds, pass from one sufferer to another through the very air a cough disturbs, remains a genuinely open question among the physicians who study it. Some already speak, quietly, of sending the wealthiest of its victims away to drier climates, to sanatoriums built in the countryside or beside the sea, on the theory that clean air alone might do what medicine cannot. For the woman in the bed beside your own, no such journey is available, nor likely ever will be. She stays here in this ward, beneath these same tall windows, breathing this same moving air that some believe might save her and others believe might have caused her illness in the first place. Two theories standing side by side, neither one currently able to prove itself right. You know her cough by now, the way you know the rhythm of the bell and the trolley, familiar enough that you no longer startle at it, though you have never once stopped noticing it entirely. Tonight, well past the hour, the ward's lamps were turned low. It comes more frequently than usual and lasts, each time, a little longer. She does not call for the nurse. She rarely does, you have noticed, preferring to ride out each spell alone, rather than trouble anyone with what she has clearly decided, some while ago, is simply the shape her nights are going to take from now on. When the coughing finally eases, she lies still for a long moment, breathing shallow and careful, and then, unexpectedly, speaks. Not to the room in general, but to you specifically, in a voice worn thin by exactly this kind of night, repeated more times than either of you could easily count. You get used to it, she says, of nothing in particular and everything at once. Not the cough? The waiting? She does not elaborate, and you do not ask her to. There is, you have come to understand, in your short time in this ward, a particular etiquette to nights like this one. Certain things are simply allowed to sit in the dark between two beds, unexplained, exactly as heavy as they need to be, and no heavier. After a while, though, she speaks again, unprompted, her voice a little steadier, now that the worst of tonight's coughing has passed. She tells you, without any particular self-pity, that she has been in and out of wards like this one for the better part of 2 years now, recovering enough each time to go home for a few weeks or a few months, only to find herself back here again once the cough returns in earnest. Her son visits when his work allows it, she says, though less often than either of them would like. And she has stopped, some while ago, asking the physicians for anything more specific than what they have already told her, because she has learned the hard way that a specific answer is not always a kinder one than a vague one. They don't know either, she adds, not unkindly, more as a simple observation than a complaint. Whatever it is that decides who gets better and who doesn't, I don't think anyone in this whole building actually knows. Elsewhere in the ward, other quiet vigils continue their own unhurried course. A daughter sits at her father's bedside, long past the visiting hours technically permit, granted a quiet exception by a sister who has long since stopped enforcing certain rules when enforcing them would serve no real purpose. She holds his hand without speaking, watching his breathing rather than his face, counting the way the sister herself might, though no one has ever taught her how. 2 rows down, an elderly man with typhoid, past the fever's worst, but not yet past its danger, sleeps fitfully beneath a nurse's steady, half-hourly attention, his wife having gone home hours ago only because the sister finally, gently, insisted she must rest herself if she intends to be any use to him tomorrow. Nearer the door, a young woman brought in with cholera, only this same evening, lies very still beneath a heap of blankets, her fever already past its worst crisis by the sheer luck of an early admission and a strong constitution, watched over by a nurse who checks her pulse every few minutes with the particular quiet urgency reserved for cases still genuinely balanced between one outcome and the other. Near 4 in the morning, without any particular drama attached to the moment, an old man, 3 beds from the ward's far end, simply stops breathing. A fever that had been climbing steadily for 3 days, finally, quietly, finishing what it started. He arrived only a week ago, a widower with no family listed in the admission ledger beyond a niece somewhere in the north, who has not yet been able to make the journey south, and he has spent most of his short stay here in a fog too thick for much conversation. Tended kindly, but without the particular attentiveness a ward reserves for patients whose families sit anxiously at the bedside, asking after every change. The nurse on duty notices his passing within minutes, not because of any sound or struggle, but because of its precise opposite, a stillness different in kind from sleep, unmistakable to anyone who has sat beside enough beds to learn the difference. She does what is done in such moments, has clearly done it many times before, and manages the whole small, sad business. A curtain, a low word to the sister, a note made in the ward book, with such practiced, unhurried gentleness that most of the ward, including you, does not fully register what has happened until well after it is already finished. There is no cry, no commotion, Nothing that would trouble the fragile rest of 30 other patients already carrying more than enough of their own. By the time the day sister arrives to take up her post, the bed has been quietly readied, and the old man's passing has already become simply one more entry in a ledger that fills night after night with exactly this kind of unremarkable, unavoidable arithmetic. It is perhaps the truest thing this ward has shown you so far. Not the drama of the operating theatre, not the tension of a diagnosis withheld, but this, death in a place like this one, arrives far more often as a quiet subtraction than a dramatic event. One bed empties, another before long will fill. The ward continues. You lie awake a while longer, listening to the old woman's breathing settle at last into something approaching real sleep, to the daughter's low, wordless murmuring 2 rows down, to the particular deep stillness that follows a death in a room too tired and too accustomed to loss to mark it any more loudly than this. Outside, the rain that has come and gone throughout your entire stay here begins again, softly, against the tall, dark windows. The same rain, you think, that has followed this whole story, since the very first page of it, patient and unhurried, exactly the way this ward itself has learned, of necessity, to be. Somewhere beyond these walls, in laboratories and lecture halls, this ward has never heard of, the century is already beginning, slowly, to change. None of that change has arrived here yet, for tonight there is only the rain and the breathing and the particular hard-won peace of a room that has learned to hold its grief quietly enough to let everyone else inside it keep sleeping. You close your eyes at last, somewhere past 5, as the faintest grey suggestion of morning begins to soften the black beyond the windows. Whatever this hospital cannot yet explain, the fevers it cannot always distinguish, the wasting illness it cannot yet cure, the invisible enemy that took the millwright in a week, none of it announces itself tonight with any particular urgency. There is only the ward, breathing around you in the dark, 30 small, quiet lives holding on, each in their own way, until morning comes to tell them what today will ask of them next. You leave in the end on an unremarkable morning, 3 weeks and some days after the carriage first brought you through the rain to this building's door. There is no particular ceremony to it. The physician who examined you that first morning confirms on his final round that whatever the illness was, never named to you in any word simpler than the Latin he offered his students, has run its course and left you, by every measure he cares to take, sound enough to manage the rest of your recovery at home. Watch and wait, it turns out, was not merely a phrase built to fill an uncomfortable silence. It was, in your case, an accurate accounting of exactly what your body needed: time, rest, the ordinary patient work of healing, that no medicine in this building could have hurried along any faster than it already has. He offers no explanation beyond a brief nod and a note passed to the house surgeon, and you find, standing at your own bedside for the last time, that you no longer mind quite as much as you once did. Some questions this ward taught you early are simply never going to be answered, and a body that heals in spite of the silence is, in the end, its own kind of answer.